Okay, good morning, everyone, and thanks for joining our masterclass, How Publishers Can Win in the Green Media Economy. So my name is Brian Murphy, and I'm the Global Chief Revenue Officer at d3con Media. And thanks to the warm introduction, I have worked at a lot of ad tech's biggest companies. I started my career at a little company called DoubleClick, which is now obviously part of the big foundation of Google's display advertising business. I also worked at AdMob, which is now part of Google's mobile advertising business, and had the chance to work at Google as part of that experience too. I've also worked at Yahoo, and maybe another one that's more relevant to today's conversation is OpenX. I spent 3 years running buyer development at OpenX, and that's important for a few reasons, because most of you probably know OpenX is one of the world's leading global ad exchanges and supply-side platforms, but OpenX is also the only company in the advertising, media, and technology industries that has met the SBTI net zero standard. And if you don't know what that means, you're in the right market masterclass, because we're going to talk about that exact topic. And a position that I also hold today that I'm really proud of is a working group chair with Ad Net Zero. And Ad Net Zero is another organization we're going to talk about in our masterclass as well today. But for those of you not familiar with Ad Net Zero, it is the nonprofit organization that's dedicated to helping the entire advertising industry better understand its impact on the environment and what we can do about it. Now, d3con Media, we are a company that are focused on trying to help publishers create and implement solutions that help them generate revenue by bringing better value advertising products to their advertisers. And we wake up every morning and try to think of ways to help publishers. Our whole existence is around bringing value to publishers at a time when we listen to publishers and we talk to publishers every day. And we're trying to understand what sort of challenges that they're facing so we can help them solve them through innovative technologies. And the publishers that we talk to are telling us a lot of the same things. As they go into 2024, we're hearing stories about audience growth challenges. We're hearing stories about revenue challenges. We're also hearing stories about the ever-changing metrics that media owners and publishers are expected to hit. It used to be viewability metrics, then it was brand safety metrics, then it was attention metrics, and now the new criteria that publishers have to really live up to is environmental sustainability metrics. And that is now the latest topic that we're trying to help solve for our publishing partners. We're also very much involved in a series of organizations throughout the industry, some of which you might be familiar with. Perhaps the one we're most proud of is that we are one of only probably fewer than 100 companies that have that GCPP badge, that Google Certified Publishing Partner badge, that is just means that we've been a vetted partner to all of Google's publishers. Okay. There's something else that you need to know about d3con Media, though. In addition to being a company that's focused on helping publishers, we're also a company that's serious about climate action. And what that means is that we have conducted our greenhouse gas inventory following the ISO 1464-1 standard and the greenhouse gas protocol. And that is something that lots of other companies have been doing in other sectors for years. We believe that every company in the advertising industry should be doing this, particularly companies that are in the business of measuring emissions from media or providing green media solutions. If you don't have your third-party verified emissions inventory report, you're just not a company that's serious about climate action. And that's something that we're proud to have released. If anybody wants to see a report, we'd be happy to share it with you. It's also publicly available with an organization called the Climate Registry, and we've recently submitted for validation of our science-based net zero target. These are the types of things that any company, whatever the industry, big or small, public or private, if you are a company that is taking climate action seriously, these are the types of steps that you should be taking, and we're proud to have taken them at d3con Media. Okay, so what are we going to talk about with our masterclass? So we have three basic categories. We're going to talk about the why first. Why is this a subject that we care about? Why are we talking about this intersection between environmental sustainability and the advertising industry? Then we're going to really dive into, well, what is the actual environmental impact of advertising? And try to understand it and quantify to break it down a little bit. But then we want to make sure we have the chance to tell you about how we look at it at d3con Media and how are we helping publishers win in the green media economy. Okay, so if we're going to start with the why, a good place to start is the Science-Based Targets Initiative. And if you're not familiar with the Science-Based Targets Initiative, or SBTI, it is a partnership between a whole bunch of other nonprofit organizations that came together in 2015 to help businesses validate their emissions reduction targets. Prior to 2015, any company could post on their website, we care about the environment and we're going to reduce our emissions by 30, 40, 50%. But nobody was ever checking their work. So Science-Based Targets Initiative was set up as a way to ensure that when a company makes a claim like that it's validated by real experts, and that if every company can set a target and do so in a way that's ambitious enough to meet the broader global campaign to cap global warming at 1.5 degrees Celsius, then we're actually going to make some real progress. And now there are over 7,600 companies that have committed to climate action with the Science-Based Targets Initiative, and they're able to do so in one of three ways. The most common that you'll hear about is a net zero target. A net zero target means that a company is going to reduce its emissions by 90% or more from a baseline year. That's a really ambitious goal to set. And when I mentioned OpenX earlier, OpenX, where I worked for 3 years, is the only company that has both set and met its net zero target, which means it has a 90% reduction off of a baseline year. You measure your emissions in 1 year, and then at some subsequent year, you've shown a 90% reduction and had that validated by the Science-Based Targets Initiative. And there are now 3,000 companies that have set net zero targets, but only one that's actually attained it. Near-term targets, that is where you set something that might be a stepping stone towards net zero, because net zero targets might be set for 2035 or 2040 or beyond. A near-term target means you're going to make a meaningful reduction in the short term, something in the next few years. A very typical near-term target might be we're going to reduce by 45 or 50% by 2030 on our journey towards net zero by 2035 or 2040. And there's a third target, which is a maintenance target. Now, that's the target that the Science-Based Targets Initiative has advised Duration Media to set, because our business is already so energy efficient and our scope 1 and 2 emissions are actually at zero. And our scope 3 emissions are already so low that the SBTI guidelines were just keep it as low as you can. And so that's the third category, and that's the one that Duration Media has set. Now, you're going to want to answer the question, why are we talking about this, right? Because if we're in the ad tech industry and we're in the publishing business, why is this something that matters to us? Well, it's because the biggest brands in the world care about this. Every brand represented up here has gone through a pretty rigorous process to set and validate their science-based target with SBTI. And these companies are our economic buyers. These are the businesses that spend billions of dollars, euros, and pounds every year on advertising. And so if they care about it, well, it makes sense for us to care about it. And some of Germany's biggest brands are also setting their science-based targets. By the way, if you're interested in learning more about any company that you might be doing business with, sciencebasedtargets.org is the SBTI website, and you can actually go in there and look up any company and ask the question, have they set a target? And if they have, what are they pledging to do? What is their emissions reduction strategy? Now, where it actually gets even more interesting and relevant for us in the advertising industry are the big agencies. If you look at the top 5 biggest agency holding companies, all 5 of them are in the SBTI database, which means that all 5 have gone through that pretty rigorous process to set and validate a science-based emissions reduction target. And that is now starting to trickle down into the rest of the industry, because you're hearing from leaders like Ollie Joyce, who's one of the biggest sustainability leaders within Group M and Mindshare, saying very clearly, as are many of his peers at some of the other holding companies, that the carbon footprint of different media distribution options is going to start to impact how we make our media decisions. And some of you might have started to see this pop up in briefs and RFIs, those questions that you get from the brands and the agencies that represent them that are typically focused on what you're offering, how can you help us reach our audiences? Well, there's a new set of questions that are starting to show up on those RFIs and briefs, and they're asking questions like, what are your annual greenhouse gas emissions, and have you set a science-based reduction target? And if you haven't seen those questions yet, trust me, they're coming, because we've seen them from lots of other publishers that we work with. Now, there's something else happening, which is the industry is starting to change the approach when it comes to standards. GARM, the Global Alliance for Responsible Media, is actually working right now on a standard that all of the entire industry is going to be able to follow when it comes to measuring emissions from media. And in the meantime, while they're working on that standard, back in June of 2023, GARM came out with a 10-point action guide for measuring the environmental impact of media. And there's two things that are really interesting when you read through this document. The first is they're trying to give guidance to buyers around being selective in how you buy your media. Obviously, you want to buy media in a way that's going to reach its objectives, which is ensuring we hit the right audience and ensuring that we have ROAS and KPIs that we're matching. But they're now also saying that you want to streamline wherever possible to make the media that you're buying more efficient from an energy standpoint and from a sustainability standpoint. But there's something else that guide is also saying, which is you want to work with companies that have publicly reported their verified emissions data, something that we mentioned earlier, Duration Media takes very seriously. So it's buy better media, but buy it from companies that are taking real climate action. And very similar messaging came out of the IAB Tech Lab also in June of last year. And by the way, Duration Media sits on the IAB Tech Lab's sustainability working group. So we were involved in the creation of this document. But if you read this one, a lot of the same messages are coming out. And this one gets a little more into the programmatic and digital media side of things, where we start to look at ways to reduce the volume of programmatic transactions to minimize energy use and data waste so as to make advertising and programmatic advertising in particular more environmentally sustainable. But once again, you're going to see another message in there about not just how you buy media, but the companies that you work with when you buy media. Ask for their publicly and verified, third-party verified and publicly reported greenhouse gas emissions inventory. Very similar messaging from both GARM and the IAB Tech Lab. Now, I mentioned earlier Duration Media's involvement with AdNet So AdNet has now over 200 companies that have joined this organization. And AdNet as I mentioned, is focused on helping the entire advertising agency, brands, agencies, media owners, and ad tech platforms better understand what is our impact on the environment and what can we do about it. Everything from how can we streamline programmatic advertising, how can we clean up ad production, make photo shoots less wasteful, and maybe the most important one is how can we leverage the power of advertising to normalize sustainable behavior through advertising creative, right? Like our business, our entire industry is focused on driving consumer behavior. Is there a way where if we start to think about and become better stewards of our industry from an environmental standpoint, that it could find its way into the creative messaging that we distribute to consumers all around the world? AdNet doesn't have a chapter in Germany yet, but they are very interested in setting one up. And if anybody wants to raise their hand and take a leadership position on this one and get AdNet set up in Germany, find me afterwards and I will make sure that we make that happen, because we think the time is right for this market to have a chapter of this important organization. And you can't talk about emissions and you can't talk about environmental sustainability without having at least one mention of standards and regulations. And if you haven't, everything we've talked about so far, you could probably read about in the trades, but this is something that you read about in the Wall Street Journal and the Financial Times and the big financial papers. Regulation is here and it's only going to get more serious. And right now, CSRD is the relatively new set of regulations that have passed from the European Union that are requiring mostly large and publicly traded companies to be a little more rigorous in terms of how they report their emissions data and their risk. But trust me, it is coming to all companies at some point. And so it's important that we really start to get started on that. Okay, so let's take it one level deeper and look at the environmental impact of digital advertising. Not just from the high level perspective, but let's look at our industry in particular. So some studies were done about 2 years ago that asked the question, what's the environmental impact or the carbon footprint of the internet? Now that would include everything from streaming to email to gaming to crypto. And the answer was 3.7% of global greenhouse gas emissions are coming from the whole digital economy and the internet at large. That was a real eye-opener for a lot of us that probably thought previously that this was somebody else's problem. This was another industry's issue to deal with. This is for agriculture, manufacturing, textiles, the food industry. But it turns out that we're actually a pretty big part of the problem as well. And by comparison, the commercial aviation industry, which I would have put up there in the top 10 list of industries that have the biggest carbon footprint, we're pretty much in the same range as the commercial aviation industry. Now, the question you might ask yourself is, well, why is that? How could there be such a connection between an industry that has no factories, no warehouses, no delivery vehicles. How could our impact be so big? Well, there's your answer, right? You've all seen different variations of this flowchart in the past. This is the crazy, wacky world that we live in of programmatic advertising that starts way over here with the advertiser and finds its way through everything from the agency to the trading desk to the ad server to the DSP, the SSP, so that finally an ad can show up on a mobile device or on a desktop computer, hopefully targeting the right user at the right time on the right page. Well, in order for that little magical transaction to happen, a lot of data has to be transferred between all of those different platforms and the data centers that power them. And guess what? Those data centers are mostly running on electricity that comes from fossil fuel-based energy sources. So there's the connection. That is why our industry has such a massive carbon footprint. It's because of those data centers that we never see. I mean, maybe some of you have, but I always say that the data centers are like the modern day factories. You just can't see the smokestacks because they're out of sight and they're out of mind. But they're still there. And that is why we need to be paying closer attention to the impact that our industry has on the environment. Because if we let this continue to run out of control, the problem is only going to get worse because programmatic advertising isn't shrinking, it's growing. So how can we enable it to grow in a way that is starting to take into consideration all the emissions that come from all those data centers? Well, that is a question that's being addressed by lots of us in the industry. And the ANA came out with a study last year that was really meant to focus on the transparency of the supply chain, but they really started to tackle the issue of looking at the programmatic supply chain through the lens of sustainability. And one of the things that came out of that study was the longer the supply chain and the more ad calls, the higher the carbon emissions. So we at Duration Media heard that and said, okay, the more ad calls, vendors, and SSPs, the higher the carbon emissions. Well, we all work in the world of ad calls and bid requests. What are some options in terms of how we can maybe try to better understand that? And so this all comes down to the issue of data waste. And data waste is something that we think about at Duration Media all the time. And so when we try to quantify data waste, we really go into this bigger question of how many ad calls and bid requests does it take to serve up a single programmatic display ad impression? And so we went with and worked with a partner of ours called Jetzt Media back in the United States, and they're really good at thinking about these types of issues. And so we said to them, how many bid requests does it take to serve up a programmatic ad impression? Well, the first thing we had to ask ourselves is the typical publisher has about, on average, 27 SSPs. Okay. And those SSPs are bidding with, on average, about 20 DSPs. And about 25% of the time, that's going to turn to a bid, which spits out a magic number of 135 bid requests. Oversimplified, probably very conservative, but if we're going to start to really quantify the problem, we need to start with a number, and our number is 135 bid requests. Not to mention all the cookie sinks that go into the delivery of that impression. And so when we really boil down how we see data waste, it's 135 bid requests. There's up to 69.7 cookie sinks per page. And we all know that conservatively, 30% of ads are never even viewed by an end user. And so at Duration Media, when we think about this, we ask the question, if we can reduce bid requests, reduce cookie sinks, and make ads more viewable, I think what we're trying to say is that that makes advertising better and more efficient and lowers its carbon footprint at the same time. And that is at the core of what we're trying to do at Duration Media. So now, how are we tackling that and turning that big, huge issue into products that we bring back to publishers? And how are we helping publishers win in the green media economy? So we like to go back to the fundamentals. And if you ever talk to anybody from the world of climate and sustainability, typically they'll boil it down to three pillars: measure, reduce, remove. In that order, every time on an annual basis. And measure means that you're looking at this with actual standards that have been adopted and used by other companies and other industries. And in our case, there will be a standard ideally coming out sometime in the middle of this year that all of us can apply to any advertising solution that will help us measure the environmental impact and the carbon footprint of a media buy by applying a standard that everybody's using. Measure, reduce then is take what you've measured and reduce as much as possible. And then remove is invest in carbon removal projects or offsets to compensate for whatever's left. And if you do this successfully year over year, that is how you start to make real change when it comes to environmental sustainability. Duration Media, we're not in the measurement business and we're not in the offset business. Our focus has always been on coming up with ways to reduce the environmental impact of advertising. And we do that by understanding, identifying, and eliminating data waste wherever we can. And to walk you through how our product works and how our offering works, I'd like to introduce you to Samir, who runs our business here in the DACH region.
So this is a setup for a publisher that uses sequency. That first impression is served after the auction. It's the same like a publisher not using sequency. But in the case of sequency, there's two things. The winning creative is loaded with technology called sequency. It will enable the publisher to measure the viewability of that ad in terms of how many pixels in view and how long are they in view. But it also loads a pot of 3 highly viewable, low-carbon impressions that you see coming up right now. And each of those require only 1 bit compared to the 135 of a standard impression of any regular campaign and also this first impression. That means that those 4 ads will not generate 540 bit requests like regular impressions would without sequency. In the case of sequency, it's 138. And that's a series reduction. It's actually per impression a reduction of 99% bit requests. So this is how it works. I mentioned the viewability. It starts actually with a publisher setting up sequency in GAM. It's a very simple process. It takes about half an hour, then you're done. You won't need your engineer for that. And after that, the winning creative is wrapped with sequency technology, which gives it the framework to signal real-time viewability. Then the publisher determines the viewability KPIs. What is the percentage of pixels in view, and for how long should they be in view? After that, sequency starts measuring the visitors on the page, the users on the page, scrolling around. Ad comes in view, and that's when the clock starts. The sequency is viewing, monitoring the percentage of the pixels and the time in view. And when the KPIs are met, viewability KPIs, then GAM is signaled to serve the second ad, which also has viewability KPIs. Are those met? Then the third ad, and so forth, until all 3 sequency ads have been served into the same ad slot using sequency technology. What happened there is that within that ad slot, not 1 ad was served, but 3 additional newly created, highly viewable, low-carbon ads were also served into that slot. So how is it different? Everybody knows what's going on before the auction. There's a lot of good work being done. It's basically curated supply path, what is happening there. Along with that are companies like Impact, Scope 3, and so forth. Then the auction takes place. And after the auction, it is when we kick in. And what we offer is curated impressions. And this is on campaign level. After everybody else has already done their sustainability magic that you see before the auction, we kick in after the auction to further reduce the carbon emissions on your impressions. And sequencing is very easy. It's easy implementation. So if I put it in my own words, you drop a creative template into GAM and you're ready to go. You don't need an engineer, so you don't have to ask for engineering resources. There's no code on page, and there's no lines of text on ads.txt. It's easy paperwork. You don't need an MSA or a contract, so you won't need your legal team. That's very sustainable. And it's just an I/O, and you can get started. And it's easy billing. It's very easy pricing. It's flat CPM. There's no license fees and so forth. So it's very easy to, for instance, run a test. You can travel fast. You can move fast on this because it requires really no effort whatsoever. The commercial benefits of sequency is publisher revenue, obviously, because you create new impressions that you can sell, but you can sell at a high CPM rate because they are highly viewable. You can also sell them into green PMPs or green client to clients requiring green products because they are very sustainable, and you sell through PMPs or direct or programmatic direct. Which means you can create additional revenue streams. What I would like to add to that is that you can also claim budget that is now going to those MFAs made for arbitrage. We used to call them made for advertising. And this is why everybody still uses these sites, because they offer a lot of reach for a very small price. And so if there was a solution, an alternative, offering lots of reach at a very low price, then people, and more sustainable in this case, people might want to consider it. Well, you're looking at that solution. It's actually Sequency offers big reach, low price, but additionally high viewability, so high quality, and it's sustainable. So it's the best deal that you can have, and it means that publishers can actually claim the budget, or at least compete with MFA sites, and be able to also win this revenue stream. You'll have a green media solution, so you can say to agencies or clients that require this, look, guys, we're ready for the future. Come with your green KPIs, because we can serve you what you need. And in the end, publishers are also able to scale down on their low-performing ad units and replace them with the high-performing, low-performing ad units that have a big carbon footprint, replace them with high-quality, highly viewable impressions from that they generate with Sequency, and it means that their entire inventory will become more sustainable in the process. Now, here's a case study how Sequency drives advertiser performance and revenue for publishers while reducing carbon emissions. That's a mouthful. So, a leading publisher, I have to read this from the screen. Sorry. A leading publisher in the home, garden, and property category leveraged Sequency to create 3 million incremental, which means additional, highly viewable impressions for a national utilities provider advertiser. So the blue bar that you see on the left, that's the baseline. So that's the reference, and on the right side you see how much new impressions were generated by Sequency. It's 122% of newly created, highly viewable, low carbon impressions. The campaign setup is the total buy entailed 5.5 million. Thank you.
Not billion.
I was about to say billion. I like big numbers. Impressions, and it was through a direct deal, and this was all served on a single domain. And the viewability settings that the publisher decided to use are pixels in view 90% and in view time of 10%. And here's some metrics coming up.
Yeah, well, so then after we've set the viewability metrics and we've identified what is a viewable ad, we then need to do some math around, well, what's the environmental impact of this campaign? So the first number we want to start with is, well, what are the grams of carbon per 1,000 impressions? And the number that's been used throughout the industry so far, before the industry standard has been created from GARM, is 255.1 grams of carbon per 1,000 programmatic display impressions. Now, we already know, on average, that there's 135 bid requests per impression, which means that we can start to quantify the environmental impact of a bid request. And that's 0.00188 grams of carbon per bid request, a tiny, tiny number, almost comical in how small it is. But when you think about how many bid requests there actually are out there, it actually becomes a really meaningful number. So going back to our baseline, right? A standard programmatic display campaign is 5.5 million impressions, which equals about 1.4 million grams of carbon. You compare that to a sequencing campaign where we still have to run that first impression that's still going to require those 135 bid requests. But all those subsequent additional impressions are only going to require one bid request. And what that means is that the carbon reduction goes down from 1.4 million grams of carbon down to just 643,000, which equals about a 55% reduction in carbon emissions. Still highly viewable, highly impactful advertising, but with a dramatically lower carbon footprint. So the end of this case study is that we were able to drive not just lower emissions, 55% lower CO2, but it also had a higher click-through rate, which was one of the metrics that was important for this particular advertiser in this particular campaign. So to summarize, sequencing. First thing, it helps publishers create highly viewable, high-valued inventory that they didn't have before. The average is about 48 to 61%. But as you could see in the case study, sometimes that number can be much, much higher. This enables those publishers to generate incremental revenue, new revenue that they didn't have before, and it's a green media solution. At a time when more buyers are asking, not just how can you make my advertising work better, but how can you help me reduce the carbon impact of the advertising that I buy and plan and buy, this is the ultimate response to the call for a green media solution. If you would like to learn more, Samir is our man on the ground here, and he is the person to talk to. And we thank you for your time today.
If you pull out your phone and you scan that QR code, you have my contact details. Thank you, everyone.
Thank you.
Thank you, guys. We have one question. We have no time to answer question.
Sorry about that. Yeah.
But may I ask you who raised this question? So we can talk in person, maybe outside the door. There's one question? Okay.
The person left already.
Okay.
Waiting for us.
So thank you.
Great.
Thank you, guys.
Thank you so much.